really no amount of alcohol is for health, but that probably like up to 1 glass wouldn't hurt you. But we wouldn't necessarily at this point say, go have alcohol so you can reduce your risk of a disease or live longer. I think just have the grapes themselves.
Dr. Sharon Horesh Bergquist, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast, talking about lifestyle medicine and specifically food is medicine.
Thank you so much, Resa. It's a pleasure. This is one of my favorite topics.
What do we mean when we say food is medicine?
We can use food to prevent chronic disease, to treat, as well as to manage. And food is actually one of our most powerful tools for our approach to disease. So we're using components of food, how they interact with different pathways in our body that lead to disease, and how we can leverage the foods that we eat to live our healthiest life.
What is chronobiology?
But when you think of food, oftentimes we focus on what we need to eat. So all the debates around nutrition, is this good for you? Is this not good for you? But chronobiology focuses on when we should eat, the timing of our meal. So we're not counting calories, we're not counting nutrients, we're counting time. And that is a very important aspect of how we metabolize foods and how foods influence our circadian biology.
First of all, there's a lot out there now about intermittent fasting and the timing of when you eat, the timing when you quote fast or just don't eat. Growing up, my grandparents used to eat at about 4:30 in the afternoon, and we thought that was ridiculous because we ate on average at 6 p.m. Most people, or as you age, or if you're a working adult, you eat maybe 7, 8 p.m. European and other countries eat quite late. I personally, the more I've committed to eating on the early side and therefore don't have a full stomach when I lay down, I feel much better and I sleep much better.
And there's so much science showing that that reinforces your circadian rhythm in an optimal way and does help you sleep better, helps the digestive system, gives your body time to repair, heal, and regenerate. As the day goes on and our melatonin levels rise towards evening, our insulin levels go down. So the same food eaten later in the day will result in a larger blood sugar spike. There's a good amount of data now showing that people who eat late at night are at higher risk of obesity, higher risk of diabetes by several fold. And so what you have just observed and found, kind of empirically seeing what works best for you is actually what's best for our biology. In addition to the what that we eat and when we eat it, how we eat, whether we're distracted on our cell phones versus eating mindfully, can impact how much we eat, how much satiety we experience after a meal, whether we form the memory of the meal and how shortly after the meal we want to eat again. It also can affect our relationship with food, whether we're eating out of true hunger. And when you tune in mindfully, you can really differentiate true hunger versus eating for multiple other reasons that we eat. Who we eat with, I think that is also underemphasized. When you look at studies that show the benefit of the Mediterranean diet, most people focus on the components of the Mediterranean diet. It's so much of the benefit is that they eat with family. It's a time people come together and there's a social connectedness that happens around food. And that has been shown to reduce anxiety, depression, huge improvement on mental health when you come together for a meal, and people make healthier food choices when they eat, as a family or with friends. And so I think looking at food in the context that we eat it is also, I think, a really important component of how food impacts us.
It makes complete sense to me, like eating in a relaxed manner, in a non-stressed manner. Also eating with people, eating even better if you really love the people with whom you're eating. Let's go back to time. Are there 3 general take-home lessons that people who want to be more healthy about the timing of their food choices of when they decide to eat that you can share?
The fundamental thing to keep in mind is how the food we eat and when we eat it impact our circadian biology. So our circadian rhythm is our day-night pattern. We know it is when we wake up, when we go to bed. But in the over a decade or so ago, we've discovered that there are peripheral clocks, not just a central clock, which controls light and dark, but each organ in our body has, our digestive system has its clock. Our liver has a clock. Even our cells have their own clock. And the way these peripheral clocks are set is actually by food. So the timing of our meals controls the cycle of these clocks. And if we're eating out of sync with the master clock, that sets our day-night pattern, really creating circadian rhythm dysfunction, we're really dampening the oscillations in our circadian biology. And that disruption is highly correlated with really every chronic disease that we know, all the metabolic diseases, and many others. So the timing of our meals matters largely for that reason. And in terms of some general take homes or rules, so the first, the benefit of intermittent fasting, there are many, but one of the main benefits is that you can switch from using glucose as your store of energy to using fat as your storage form of energy. And our bodies, of course, we have tremendous ability to store fat. And that switching back and forth between burning glucose and burning fat makes us more metabolically flexible. And it creates balance between building up our fat stores and then bringing down our fat stores. So it's a natural rhythm that our bodies have adapted to over millions of years of our ancestral biology. When we constantly are eating and don't have that break with fasting, we're continually in buildup mode. So we're building fat. We're continually keeping our insulin level elevated, and insulin's a fat storage hormone. And that, of course, is detrimental not just to metabolic health, but it also sends a signal to our cells to continually be in growth mode. And while that may sound good, our cells actually need time to repair and heal and regenerate. So too much growth, even at a cellular level, is not good for us. To get your body to transition from burning glucose to burning fat, you need to go at least around 12 hours without eating. That's when you deplete your glycogen stores and your body taps into fat, which we convert to ketones as our source of energy. And so the first thing to try and do is to go at least 12 hours. So what that could look like is stopping eating 2 to 3 hours before bed, and then trying to wait at least an hour after waking before we start eating again. And I'm going to make a note here that we're talking about the first caloric intake. So it's not just food. For people who start the day with coffee, if that coffee has cream, you've broken the fast. Same with some liquids, like a glass of wine before bed. Well, that's still caloric intake. So you want to end all caloric intake and limit it to those 12 hours. When you go past the 12 hours of fasting, of course, you're going to get added benefit because then your body's in fat burning mode. The ketones help with a lot of the regeneration, stimulating our cellular responses to fasting, which generally tell our cells to do some house cleaning functions, such as autophagy, which kicks in more with longer durations of fast. So really kick in these cellular functions longer if you can go more than 12 hours. When you look at fasting from a metabolic benefit, probably the sweet spot is eating in about a 10-hour window. You get some incremental benefits going further down to 8. The 16-8 diet is probably the most popular, but that 16-8 diet really comes from rodent studies, and you and I are not rodents. And we need to really think of what makes sense in a human context. And it's also different depending on a person's health status, their age, et cetera. So just because 16-8 is optimal in the clinical trials done on animals, you can adapt it to suit your own needs. Now, the second thing I would have people do is look at the window during which you're eating in terms of the time of the day. If you look at intermittent fasting studies where people have a very early morning window, they show tremendous benefit in terms of reducing insulin resistance and a lot of metabolic benefit, increased antioxidant enzymes. Even midday eating windows show benefit. People who have late night eating windows tend to not show the same benefit. That does not mean you have to wake up and eat breakfast. It does not make, having breakfast the most important meal of the day. It's just that you want to have most of your calories earlier in the day.
I think the important thing to emphasize to people is that food can absolutely taste good. It should taste good. And also, your body, if you get into this rhythm, you adapt and actually you don't feel hungry. You don't feel compromised. You don't feel like you're sacrificing. And in fact, you actually feel healthy and good.
And so much of what we even consider restrictive is purely cultural. If you looked at it from the standpoint of our cells don't understand what we're doing when we're eating late at night. Like, they are confused. This is their time to wind down and start doing their housekeeping functions. And we're telling them, no, ramp up and get ready to metabolize and burn food and digest it. Our ancestors did this as a way of life. It really just changed rapidly in the last couple hundred years. So what we do today is actually very foreign to our body. And this is the unnatural state, not fasting. Um, so I think we're really just discovering through the science what is optimal for our biology. And it's not really surprising that our biology was optimized over generations, just as, our ancestors' survival depended on being able to go long periods of time without food. So
There's a few things that you mentioned that I want to name tag. One is gardening and the other is coffee. Gardening also meets one of the pillars of lifestyle medicine, which is movement. But importantly, gardening is related to soil and the dirt in which our food grows. You had a very thought-provoking episode with someone that actually is talking about how soil, nutrients in soil, quality of soil, health of soil has changed, and therefore it's affecting the food we eat.
quality of our soil, and really the living forms of life in the soil are changing due to a host of factors that are more environmental farming practices, and that impacts the nutrition in the foods that we eat. But how our food is sourced, the quality of the soil in which it's grown, are all factors that influence the nutritional value of that food. For example, if we ate a strawberry, if that strawberry is a farmed, like conventional crop, it's going to have less phytochemicals than an organic or a wild strawberry, because the reason plants make phytochemicals, which are the plant chemicals that give fruits and vegetables and plants a lot of their anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and anti-cancer benefit, is they make it as a way to deter insects, and it's essentially a herbicide, a pesticide that they naturally make, and it also deters like fungi and bacteria and viruses. A fruit is out in the wild, it's going to naturally need to defend itself. When we farm our fruits and vegetables and we are spraying all kinds of pesticides on them, we're really preferentially growing our crops for carbohydrate intake. We're not growing them for phytochemicals. So the quality of the soil, how we farm, the farming practices affect the nutritional value of the foods that we eat. And then the other really important point about how really our farming practices and have changed our dietary eating is in the diversity of the foods that we eat. So there are about 30,000 edible foods. We cultivate around 150, and only about 30 of them make it on our plate each year. The impact that on our health is, I think, something that would be worth sharing, because when we restrict the diversity of our diet, we're restricting the phytochemicals, so all those powerful chemicals that fight disease and enhance our longevity. We're restricting the fiber, the diversity of fiber, which restricts the diversity of our gut microbiome. A person can theoretically be eating what we consider healthy, right? Say a blueberry smoothie. But if they have that every morning, they have the same blueberry smoothie with 2 pinches of kale and etc., they're not getting diversity. So they're not optimizing their diet. So even within a healthy diet, there are ways where we could be doing better.
Coffee, black coffee.
To everything, there's always the question, well, how much? um, the short answer is generally yes. Coffee has tremendous health benefits. And of course, I'm assuming in moderation. But coffee, of course, has vitamins and minerals, but it has phytochemicals. So it has ferulic acid. The phytochemical gives it a lot of antioxidant and anti-inflammatory benefit. Coffee is associated with reduced risk of premature mortality from a host of chronic diseases. You don't need a scientific study to tell you that your focus and cognitive function is better when you drink coffee. You're more alert. Interestingly, mood is better. That's something that often doesn't get said enough. But less depression, more elevated mood.
I love this short answer concept. How about the short answer on red wine?
So, I think there's been a little bit of a turnaround. I think for a while, it was assumed that red wine, because it has so many antioxidants from the grapes, that it was a health food. The current shift is that really no amount of alcohol is for health, but that probably like up to one glass wouldn't hurt you. But we wouldn't necessarily at this point say, go have alcohol so you can reduce your risk of a disease or live longer. So um, I think just have the grapes themselves.
What about the short answer on avocados?
That one, it's a little harder to give a very short answer, but I guess my very short answer is going to be not as healthy as one would think. But with avocados, I think you have to ask the question compared to what? So avocados compared to butter, of course, healthy. Avocados compared to, fruit in a smoothie. If you're trying to make avocado toast or a smoothie, I would definitely say the smoothie. Avocados are very high in fat and they're very high in calories. So there's about 320 calories or so in an avocado, about 30 grams of fat in an avocado. A serving is a quarter. Most people have the whole avocado. So a lot of overconsumption. And, it also has a lot of fiber. There's about 14 grams of fiber. So it does benefit the microbiome. But when we have excess calories or too much fat intake, the excess calories relative to how many calories we burn contribute to insulin resistance. And it's very easy to go down the path of over consuming fat and calories, even with, quote, healthy fats.
Go into an explanation for the audience of why healthy fats are still fats and they actually may not be great for our muscles. And I'm going to bring in another food that is very fatty that people think is good to consume, and I'll even say over-consume, and that's salmon.
I think this is a really important point because when we have excess fat and really also excess calories relative to expenditure, our bodies store the fat and it makes its way inside our cells. So we store it inside the cells where it impacts our mitochondria. And it impacts metabolic health when it reduces the efficiency of our mitochondria. So if we remember from our biology class, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells. Metabolism, by definition, is how efficiently we can break down food and use that food as energy. And when our mitochondria are dysfunctional, so mitochondrial dysfunction, we can't efficiently get energy from the foods we eat and produce that energy. When we have fat in our cells, it impedes mitochondrial function. When the mitochondria are impaired, they can't break down fat as effectively. And so you get in a vicious cycle where you are already have a slower or less efficient metabolism. The metabolism can't break down the fat. The fat further builds up in our cells and further slows down our mitochondrial function and our metabolic health. The way we break that cycle, we of course can exercise to increase our mitochondrial volume as well as the efficiency of our mitochondria. And we can reduce our total caloric intake and, of course, our fat intake. That what we were touching on earlier with the timing of our meals and intermittent fasting, by virtue of intermittent fasting tapping into fat stores, that's also a very effective way to kind of reverse this process of cyclical further damage into our mitochondria.
And salmon.
Yeah, salmon, I think the mindset around it has been that, okay, it has some good fat, the omega-3 fatty acids, but of course it also has saturated fat. When salmon is farmed, the amount of saturated fat relative to the omega-3 is going to be higher. So if you think about, salmon, just like if we don't move and we're sedentary, which a lot of farmed salmon are, and if the salmon are fed instead of having to swim and find algae, their fat content is going to be different, just as we would accumulate fat if we were, kept under those conditions. So we are seeing a higher amount of saturated fat relative to the good fat by virtue of how the salmon is prepared before it makes it on our plate. So wild salmon is still a better choice, but exactly, I think people assume that it's just good fat. But of course, it's a very fatty fish with a high amount of the good and the less healthy fat.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of protein? How we can really make sure we're getting enough protein? How can we think about this healthily?
Protein is obviously a very important part of dietary intake, and maintaining muscle mass is critical for how well we age. I will first start off by saying no matter how much protein you eat, if you're not doing exercise, you're not magically going to have that protein turn into muscle. So this is really a multi-component approach to maintaining your muscle mass, of which the protein intake is one part of. The protein, the first is we have to look at our protein needs, and they change with age. They change with different conditions. If you take the bare minimum, the recommended daily allowance, just to maintain muscle mass, it's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. If a person is older, 70 years or older, it's closer to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And so our needs change because of how we absorb and assimilate that protein. So, I think that's a really important point, and it's a continuum. It's not that suddenly at age 70 things change. As you're going each decade, you can assume that you need a little bit more. If a person's consuming a plant-based diet, it's probably closer to 0.9 grams per kilogram just for maintenance. Now, if a person is exercising and trying to build and maintain muscle mass, the amount of protein intake is considerably more. Um, Pretty much double that low amount from the RDA. So it's closer to like 1.2 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight. So the first is getting a sense of how much you need of protein. From there, trying to figure out how to get that protein and make sure it's quality protein in terms of the amino acid components in that protein, and to also make sure that what that protein is packaged with are not components that take away from health. So they're not excessively high in saturated fat or heterocyclic amines or TMAO or other compounds that could be harmful. Um, Probably one of the biggest myths is that plant food don't have all of the essential amino acids that we need. Each plant food does. It's just that it's not in the proportion that we need. And what we need to do if we're going to get our protein sources from plant food is to make sure that we are combining grains with beans. The limiting amino acid in grains is lysine typically, and it's often methionine in grains. So in a 24-hour period, you need to get some combination of those two. Some people just simply don't have the appetite to get all of their protein, vitamins, minerals, fiber in a 24-hour period. And some people do use animal sources to do that. And I think if you're going to do that, just picking sources that are low in saturated fat, like absolute lean cuts. If you can do non-fat dairy, I think that's helpful. Meat is about 40% or so saturated fat. The remainder is unsaturated fat. So every food, whether it's plant or animal, has some saturated and some unsaturated. No food is entirely one or the other. The proportion is higher in animal products, but Still, meat is majority unsaturated fat, but because it has a relatively higher percentage, getting lean cuts is just going to be super important if you are going to use animal sources to get your protein intake.
What's the short answer on eggs?
The short answer on eggs is they're fine. And this is another almost turnaround in how the science has been. The concern around eggs was because they're high in dietary cholesterol. It was thought that because cholesterol contributes to cardiovascular disease and eggs are high in dietary cholesterol, that eggs may not be a healthy food. What we know now is that dietary cholesterol has very little contribution to our cholesterol levels. What our liver makes is the biggest factor, and saturated fat is what makes our liver make LDL, the quote bad cholesterol. I think the turnaround is that eggs are fine. They do not seem to increase risk of cardiovascular disease. One egg a day, fine. There's a meta-analysis looking at eggs and diabetes where over 3 eggs a week, there was an association with slightly higher risk. So like everything else, moderation, not just an egg only, that's your only breakfast, but I think it can be a part of a healthy breakfast. An egg has about 6 grams of protein. To put that in context, that's about the same as a handful of almonds.
What I'd like to do is offer the audience resources if they want to learn more, if they want to have someone in their town, in their city with whom to speak. Where should they start?
If a person is looking for a dietitian, a health coach, or a physician that is well-versed in using lifestyle as medicine, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine has a website that has identified people who are certified and people that you could potentially look up in your area. Specifically looking at the dietary component, I think there are really wonderful websites, Forks Over Knives, nutritionfacts.org. So social media is a really good resource.
If the audience wants to follow you and your work and learn more from you, what's the best way to do
You
that?
can follow me on Instagram, again, at Dr. Sharon Bergquist. My website is also drsharonbergquist.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. It's Dr. Sharon Bergquist. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, comments. Please feel free to share. I love healthy conversations around this topic, and I welcome every point of view.
Thank you so much for joining the Visible Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trend spaces. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Find me at Resa E. Lewis, MD on social media or visit thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and watch our episodes on YouTube. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not reflect the opinions of their institutions. Information shared here should never substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice. Together, we're making healthcare more equitable, one visible voice at a time.